I did not expect any of this, not on that Tuesday night, over our usual quiet dinner. Yet, there it was like a dart thrown into the center of a dark, unsuspecting target. Rachel, as composed as ever, looked up from her pasta, pushing her hair back in that way she always does when she's about to say something that might raise eyebrows. "I'll be meeting Nate tomorrow night," she said casually. "The junior partner. You remember me mentioning him? We're working on that joint merger case, and he's been helpful." She said it all so effortlessly, her voice smooth, as if she were merely discussing a new client or tomorrow's weather. But I felt something land in the pit of my stomach, a faint, nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the way she brushed over the details, or how she immediately looked down after saying his name, busying herself with her plate. "Nate," I repeated, tasting the name as if it were bitter. "You've talked about him, yeah." I paused, watching her closely. "In this meeting? Dinner, I take it?" Her eyes flicked up at me, the smallest flash of something unreadable crossing her face before she gave a quick nod. "Yes, it's just dinner. He's been supportive. Working those long hours together, you know how it is." I did know, but Rachel had never, in all our years together, gone out of her way for casual dinners with colleagues. She was the sort to clock out with a nod and beeline straight home, barely pausing to make small talk. This sudden shift was like watching a thread unravel from the edge of an old sweater, barely noticeable. Yet once you see it, you can't look away. "What time are you meeting him?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "And where?" She smiled, taking a sip of her wine. "It's a little place on Oak Lawn Avenue. Nothing fancy, just one of those spots I think you'd like actually." I wanted to press further, to ask why the sudden need for a supportive dinner, but I let it go. Something about the way she moved on from the topic, like she had rehearsed this line and ticked it off her mental checklist, made me decide against it. Instead, I nodded, masking any hint of suspicion behind a thin smile. We finished dinner in near silence, the low hum of the dishwasher filling the space between us. She mentioned Nate once more in passing, referring to him as a steady mind in her busy law firm, a place where pressure was a constant, pushing everyone to the brink. Then she excused herself, leaving her half-finished glass of wine and disappearing into her study with her phone. That was when I noticed something else strange. Her phone, which she usually left on the counter, was tucked firmly in her hand, as if she couldn't bear to part with it. After she closed the door, I sat there, contemplating everything. The late nights, the impromptu working weekends, and those lingering looks she'd been giving the mirror each morning. It all played back like a movie I hadn't realized I'd been watching. It was subtle, a series of small, almost imperceptible changes. But in that moment, they all came together, forming a picture I didn't like. For the first time in our 18 years of marriage, I felt something akin to suspicion, and it unsettled me. I couldn't dismiss the growing feeling that Rachel's behavior was more than just her response to grief or stress. There was something else, a shift in her I couldn't ignore. I tried to shake off the unease and remind myself of the years we'd built together, the shared moments, the life we had. We'd weathered the hardest storms, none worse than the loss of our son. Those months of helplessness and grief had almost crushed us, leaving us two shadows in the same house, barely talking, barely there. But after the grief came a silence that settled like dust, and though we carried on, it seemed Rachel never fully returned from it. The next morning, I found her in front of the bedroom mirror, more absorbed than I'd seen her in a long time. She wore a crisp white blouse, one I hadn't seen in ages, and a subtle touch of makeup that brought a bit of color to her face. It wasn't her usual work attire. There was something extra, a quiet confidence that I hadn't seen since before everything changed. "Big case today?" I asked, attempting casualness, though I felt like a stranger watching her. Rachel's eyes met mine in the mirror, a faint smile lingering on her lips. "Not especially. Just keeping things polished." She turned, flashing me a smile that, under other circumstances, might have seemed innocent. But her face told a different story, one I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. After she left, I took a moment to breathe, hoping that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was nothing more than the toll of stress or grief resurfacing. But it gnawed at me, a feeling as subtle as a whisper, yet as persistent as a drumbeat. By the time I arrived at my office, I couldn't shake it. I closed the door, letting the familiar calm of my surroundings ground me. And that's when I remembered Eric, a private investigator I'd helped a few years back on a property deal. Eric had mentioned in passing that he owed me a favor. At the time, I'd laughed it off, not imagining I'd ever need such a service. But now it seemed less outlandish. I didn't let myself hesitate. Picking up the phone, I dialed Eric's number, pacing the office as I waited for him to pick up. When his voice came through, familiar and warm, I didn't waste time. "Eric, it's Jason," I said. "I think I might need your expertise. It's personal." There was a pause, followed by a low chuckle. "All right, Jason, I'm all ears." So I told him, outlining the subtle shifts, the guarded behavior, the late nights and guarded phone. I didn't hold back, giving him every detail I could remember, right down to the dinner with Nate. When I finished, Eric's voice was level. "I can look into it. It's delicate, I get that. But, Jason, are you sure?" Was I sure? I hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. In the silence, every suspicious detail replayed in my mind, weaving into something I couldn't ignore any longer. "Yes," I replied. "Look into it, Eric. I need to know." As I hung up, a weight settled in my chest. This was a line I couldn't uncross. The days that followed my conversation with Eric felt like a slow-motion dive into an undertow. Each minute seemed to stretch, pulling me deeper into currents I could hardly see but felt keenly. I hadn't heard from Eric since I'd made the call, but I knew better than to rush him. Patience, he'd once told me, is often a sharper blade than anger. On Thursday afternoon, just as I was closing my office, my phone lit up with a message from him. A simple "I have something, meet tonight," along with an address to a dimly lit bar in Oak Cliff. Eric was a man of few words, and this brief message carried a heavy weight. When I arrived, Eric was already seated, a whiskey in hand. He glanced up at me with a nod, motioning for me to join him. I ordered a drink, feeling my heart thud in my chest as I waited for him to start. He took a moment, sipped his whiskey, then slid a manila envelope across the table. "Take a look," he said, his tone even, eyes watching me carefully. Inside were photographs, Rachel and Nate caught in moments that spoke volumes. The first was innocuous enough. Rachel laughing, leaning in close as they sat at a corner table in a small, upscale wine bar. I recognized the place immediately. It was one of the restaurants we used to frequent on our date nights, before things became strained. Seeing her there, seated with Nate in what had once been our space, was like a punch to the gut. The photos continued, each one more damning than the last. In one, Rachel rested her hand on Nate's arm, her expression warm, even affectionate. In another, they were leaving the bar, their heads close, sharing something just between the two of them. The final shot was the worst. Nate's hand at the small of her back, guiding her to a car as if they were more than mere colleagues. She's really gone there," I murmured, more to myself than to Eric. "Seems like it," he replied evenly. "They were there for nearly 2 hours. And this isn't the first time, Jason. They've been meeting like this for weeks at different places. But here's the thing. There's more." I looked up sharply. "More?" He nodded, leaning back. "Nate's married, too. His wife's name is Allison. 2 kids, nice house in Highland Park. The guy seems to have a family life that he's compartmentalized, if you catch my drift." This revelation was unexpected, and the wheels in my mind began to turn faster. Nate wasn't just some carefree single man pursuing my wife. He was someone who had something equally at stake. My anger sharpened, morphing into something far colder, more calculating. "So, he's juggling a family and my wife?" I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. Eric's lips twitched in a slight smirk. "Seems that way. There's a certain recklessness about it, which is good news for you if you're thinking about leveraging it." "Tell me everything," I said, leaning forward, feeling the hunger for every last detail. Eric went on, outlining the patterns he'd pieced together from Nate's meetings with Rachel. They always met outside the city, never the same spot twice. According to Eric's sources, they'd booked a weekend together in Austin, just the two of them, under the guise of a client conference. And here was the kicker. They'd chosen one of the very hotels Rachel and I used to escape to, a cozy inn by Ladybird Lake. My jaw clenched as I processed the information. I thought back to the last weekend Rachel had worked late, that excuse of a case review. It was becoming all too clear now, and I felt a wave of something sharp and acrid twist in my gut. Eric's voice brought me back. Now listen, if you want to really shake things up, there's something else. I can reach out to Allison, Nate's wife. We could give her a little hint. Sometimes it helps to have allies in these situations, especially if we're going for maximum impact. I considered this, picturing the storm that could unfold if Allison knew. It wouldn't take much, just a hint. If she was even half as blindsided as I had been, her reaction could make things very interesting. And with the Austin weekend looming ahead, the timing was perfect. Do it, I said finally. But keep it subtle, just enough to make her start questioning him. I want this to hit him from all sides. Eric nodded, a glint of approval in his eye. Consider it done. And one more thing, you may want to keep an eye on your messages. I have a feeling the pieces will start falling soon. I paid for our drinks and left with the envelope tucked inside my jacket, the weight of it a strange comfort. Back home, I tucked the photos away, careful not to leave any trace of my findings. Rachel hadn't returned yet, claiming a late review session that stretched well into the night. By then, I was beyond wondering what she was really up to. The next day, as I was wrapping up a meeting, a message buzzed on my phone. It was from an unknown number. Just thought you should know, Nate is the type to keep more than one woman on his calendar. He's done this before. Be careful. My pulse quickened. Who could know about Nate's affairs? The text was unsigned, and there was no clue as to its sender. I dialed the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. Could it be Allison? Or perhaps some other woman Nate had tangled with in the past? The message hinted at a larger web, one that Nate was weaving while dangling Rachel as a pawn. I stared at my phone, feeling an odd thrill as I considered the possibilities. Rachel might think she was special, the one catching Nate's eye in her busy law firm. But if this message was true, she was merely part of a larger pattern. When I spoke to Eric later that evening, he confirmed that he'd made the contact with Allison, discreetly sending her a photo of Nate and Rachel, captioned simply, "Do you know where your husband is tonight?" According to Eric, Allison's response was immediate. She replied with only 2 words, "Who are you?" To which Eric had answered, "A friend." "She's going to start digging," he said, clearly pleased with the setup. "And with a little push, she'll be right where you need her." As I hung up, I realized that the trap was almost complete. Nate's facade of innocence was beginning to crumble, and with his own wife on the trail, he wouldn't see me coming. That evening, Rachel came home early, an unusual move for her lately. I watched her closely as she slipped off her heels, her face brighter, almost lighter, as if she were carrying a new secret, one that revitalized her. She poured herself a glass of wine, leaning on the counter with a practiced nonchalance that only fueled my curiosity. "Good day?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, though I already knew what her evening held. She glanced at me, her eyes holding a glint that was hard to read. "Productive," she replied simply. "Busy as ever. I think we're finally making headway on that case." She downed her wine and excused herself to the shower, her usual guardedness replaced with a strange sense of satisfaction that I found both irritating and intriguing. In a few days, she'd be packing for Austin, unknowingly stepping into the final stages of my plan. And with Allison now on high alert, I knew there would be no escape, no easy way out for either Rachel or Nate. The day after our last conversation, my phone buzzed as I was pouring coffee. A new message from an unknown number. "Jason, this is Allison. I think we need to talk." It was a moment I'd anticipated, yet seeing her name on my screen carried an edge of reality I hadn't fully prepared for. I quickly sent her a time and location, quiet, private, somewhere no one would expect either of us. I spent the rest of the day making careful preparations, knowing that once Allison and I compared notes, there'd be no turning back. By evening, I was at the dimly lit corner booth of an out-of-the-way cafe. Allison arrived shortly after, her face tight, holding the kind of mask that only someone under fire could maintain. She sat across from me, eyes narrowing in careful assessment. Up close, I could see the exhaustion in her face, the look of someone who'd been dealing with shadows far longer than she'd admit. "Allison," I said, leaning in, "thank you for coming." She nodded, offering a polite, wary smile. "I suppose this meeting was inevitable, wasn't it?" Her voice was steady, but I detected the faintest tremor. I pushed the manila envelope across the table, just as Eric had done for me. "You might want to see these before we talk." She took a breath, then opened the envelope, her hand steady as she flipped through the photos. Nate with Rachel at the bar, their heads tilted close, her hand resting on his arm. The last photo, the one of them leaving the bar together, left her hand frozen in place. "So it's true," she murmured, her tone dark. "He's really been," she trailed off, catching herself as she composed her expression. "I suspected, of course. Late nights, secretive phone calls. But I thought I was imagining it. Or that maybe it was just work stress." "I know the feeling," I replied almost wryly. "It all starts small, doesn't it? Little hints here and there. Then suddenly, the pieces come together, and you're left staring at a picture you didn't know you were putting together." She nodded, and for a moment, we sat in silence. Two strangers connected by betrayal. She placed the photos back in the envelope, looking up at me with an intensity that cut right through. "What are you planning to do?" she asked, her voice low. I had thought carefully about this, every detail orchestrated like a symphony. "They're heading to Austin this weekend," I began. "I want to catch them in the act, without room for excuses or explanations. I have a contact who's helped me with this. I can have surveillance set up at their hotel. And once we have everything, we confront them publicly. Let them see that they're not as invisible as they think." She considered this, her gaze hardening. "I want to be there. I want him to see what he's done, what he's throwing away." I nodded. "That's why I reached out to you. I knew this wouldn't be something either of us could handle alone." A dark glint flashed in her eye. "You realize this will destroy them, right? They'll lose everything." "That's the idea," I said flatly. "They chose this. They crossed every line, hid every lie, and thought we'd be too trusting or too foolish to notice." She took a deep breath, her resolve clear. "Then we do this. Together. With our strategy set, we discuss the details. I would arrange for Eric to set up surveillance in Austin, confirming their arrival and keeping us updated. Then, on the night of the affair, Allison and I would arrive unannounced. As we finished planning, I realized we still had one obstacle to handle before the weekend: our anniversary. Rachel and I had always marked the day with some kind of gesture, even as our relationship became more of a formality. But this year, I planned something different. A dinner at a place we hadn't been in years, somewhere beautiful and intimate. I made the reservation, knowing exactly how I wanted this to play out. The morning of our anniversary, I planted a small recorder in Rachel's car, carefully tucking it under the seat where she wouldn't see it. Another in her office, too. She'd been leaving her phone behind during lunch breaks lately, a new habit that told me she was likely communicating with Nate at work. By that evening, I knew I'd have a full record of their conversations, their secrets, all the proof I needed. When Rachel came home that evening, she looked hesitant. She greeted me with a thin smile, a touch of guilt lingering behind her eyes. Or perhaps that was just my imagination. I played my part, acting every bit the unsuspecting husband, dressed and ready for a celebration I knew she was already planning to miss. "Dinner at Lumen tonight," I said with a smile, naming the restaurant where we'd spent our early anniversaries. "Got a reservation, and I might have even picked up a little surprise for you." She blinked, caught off guard. "Tonight? You went to all that trouble?" I held her gaze, searching for any hint of sincerity. "Why wouldn't I? It's our anniversary, Rachel." For a split second, she looked as if she might falter. But then she glanced away, forcing a smile. "It's just, I'm swamped with work, Jason. Nate and I are on deadline. We have to get everything filed before tomorrow." "Nate!" I repeated his name slowly, watching her expression carefully. "And this is something only the two of you can handle?" "Jason, it's not what you think," she said quickly, her words rushed. "I promise. I need to finish this case. We're almost there." "Then go," I replied, my voice calm. "Do what you need to do. She looked relieved, almost grateful, and in that moment, I saw her for what she had become, a woman so entangled in her own web of lies that she'd begun to believe them. She left within the hour, her car pulling out of the driveway, leaving me in the silence of our home. I went straight to the recorder, feeling the rage burn anew as I listened to her hushed calls with Nate, talking about their plans for Austin, about the perfect getaway that would make up for tonight. Every word was like gasoline on a fire, each one confirming the extent of her betrayal. But it was one detail that caught my attention most. Nate telling Rachel that he couldn't stand coming home to the icy silence of his own marriage. He painted himself as a victim, a man starved for affection, spinning tales of emotional neglect that he used as justification. It was sickening to listen to, the way he manipulated her, drawing her deeper into his orbit, casting his wife as the villain in some twisted story. By the time I finished listening, my plan had crystallized. The evidence was indisputable, and with Allison in the mix, the entire stage was set. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and looked out at the city skyline, knowing that within days, everything would change. Rachel and Nate had their weekend in Austin to look forward to, their moment of triumph and secrecy. And when they arrived, they'd have no idea that Allison and I would be right behind them, ready to expose every lie they'd crafted, every secret they'd tried to keep. The air felt thick with anticipation as I drove to Austin that Saturday, my mind churning with everything that had led to this moment. I had checked in with Eric early that morning, confirming that Rachel and Nate were already en route to the hotel, no doubt eager for their getaway. Allison had gone down the night before, giving her the time and space she needed to prepare herself. As for me, I was running on adrenaline and a razor-sharp resolve. When I arrived, I didn't bother with the front desk. Instead, I slipped into a quieter part of the lobby, positioning myself in a secluded corner with a clear view of the entrance. My phone buzzed, a message from Eric with a fresh photo of Rachel and Nate standing by the reception desk, both of them looking almost giddy as they checked in together. There was a pang in my chest seeing her there, dressed in a way I hadn't seen in years, her hand resting on Nate's arm as she leaned into him. But it was quickly overtaken by a grim satisfaction. They'd set this trap for themselves, and I was merely watching it spring shut. Allison was already stationed nearby, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, blending in with the casual hotel guests. When she caught sight of me, she gave a quick, discreet nod, confirming that she was ready. Now, it was only a matter of time. As Rachel and Nate disappeared down the hall, I dialed her number, masking my tone to sound exactly like the unsuspecting husband I no longer was. "Rachel," I began, feigning casual cheerfulness. "Just checking in. How's the conference going?" There was a slight pause on her end, the sound of hushed movements in the background. "Oh, Jason, it's good. Busy, you know. These things always are." She tried to sound casual, but I could hear the forced steadiness in her voice, the hesitation that betrayed her. "Glad to hear it," I replied. "Just wanted to make sure you were settling in." "Yes, definitely. Listen, I'm about to head into a session, so I'll let you go," I cut in smoothly. "Just wanted to say hi." As I hung up, I could picture her face, perhaps a flash of guilt, or maybe just the relief that I hadn't sensed her betrayal. That fleeting image was all the more satisfying knowing that soon, she would have nowhere left to hide. Around dinner time, Eric sent me a series of photos. Rachel and Nate had just finished eating at a cozy bistro near the hotel, their hands brushing across the table, their faces alight with some shared joke. After dinner, they returned to the hotel, disappearing down the hall toward their room. Another photo arrived moments later, the two of them entering a private suite and Nate's hand lingering at her waist as he guided her through the door. That was my cue. I motioned to Allison, who was now seated across from me, her gaze fixed and determined. We'd rehearse the next steps, planning the timing down to the second. She'd confront Nate in the lobby, and I would catch the whole thing from a distance. As we approached the front desk, Allison took a steadying breath, steeling herself. She moved toward the main entrance, watching as other guests mingled about, completely unaware of the storm about to break. I positioned myself just outside the lobby bar, hidden but with a clear view of the elevator banks and the main area. I didn't have to wait long. Rachel and Nate stepped out of the elevator, laughing quietly, their heads close. They walked together, looking completely oblivious to the world around them. But as they reached the lobby, Allison stepped out of the shadows and into their path, her gaze fixed solely on Nate. "Nate," she said, her voice carrying an edge that cut through the murmurs around us. Nate froze, his face losing color as he processed her sudden appearance. "Allison," he stammered, glancing around as though he were searching for some quick escape. Allison's voice sharpened, loud enough for others in the lobby to take notice. "So this is what a work trip looks like, Nate?" She glanced pointedly at Rachel, her lips twisting in a bitter smile. "Nice to finally meet your partner." Rachel's face went pale as the realization hit, her hand flying up to her mouth. "Oh my God!" "Allison, don't pretend to be surprised," Allison snapped, her eyes blazing. "How long did you think you could keep this up?" Nate tried to step between them, his voice a desperate whisper. "Allison, please, let's talk about this in private." "Oh, you're worried about privacy now?" She shot back, her voice dripping with contempt. "You didn't seem to care about privacy when you were booking hotel rooms with my husband." A ripple of murmurs swept through the lobby as onlookers caught on to the confrontation unfolding before them. Rachel shifted, looking for an exit, but Allison moved to block her. "No, Rachel," Allison said, her voice deadly calm. "You're going to stay right here and own this." "Did he tell you, by the way, that you weren't the first? Or did he spin his usual story about how neglected he feels at home?" Rachel's face twisted in shock and horror. "What? Nate, what is she talking about?" Nate glanced at her, his expression a mixture of guilt and anger. "Rachel, let's go upstairs. We don't need to do this here." But Rachel took a step back, shaking her head as the weight of Allison's words settled over her. You told me you felt trapped," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You said she didn't understand you anymore." Allison crossed her arms, looking at Nate with cold satisfaction. "Well, Rachel, welcome to reality. This is the man you threw your life away for." Rachel turned back to Nate, a flicker of desperation in her eyes. "Nate, please, we can fix this. We can make it work." But Nate's gaze hardened, and he seemed to shrink under the weight of it all. "Maybe we should both go our separate ways," he muttered, glancing away. "I don't need this." The finality of his words seemed to drain Rachel, her shoulders slumping as if the ground itself were shifting beneath her. And in that moment, I saw her for what she was, a woman who'd gambled everything and lost. As she turned, she caught my eye, her face going rigid with recognition. She took a single step toward me, her eyes wide, as though she were seeing a ghost. "Jason, you're here?" I held her gaze, offering nothing more than a cold, unreadable stare. "Did you think I wouldn't be?" She looked like she might collapse, but instead, she straightened, the color draining from her face. "So all of this, you planned it?" "Yes," I replied simply, my voice carrying a finality that left no room for misunderstanding. "And now, Rachel, there's nothing left to hide." I watched as realization dawned in her eyes, the full scope of what she'd done settling heavily on her shoulders. She looked around, taking in the hushed stares of the onlookers, the open contempt in Allison's gaze, and the faint, immovable anger in mine. She had nowhere left to go, and in that crowded lobby, surrounded by strangers who now knew her shame, she finally seemed to understand the depth of her own betrayal. The drive back to Dallas was quiet. The road stretched out like a thin, silver ribbon under a sky that darkened by the mile. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that follows after a storm has wreaked its havoc, leaving the ground scorched and still. By now, Rachel would be back at the house, likely rehearsing the story she thought she could spin to make the entire Austin debacle vanish. But I wasn't done yet. There was still one final move left to make. Once home, I wasted no time setting up the last stage of my plan. I called up Emily, a friend of Eric's who knew exactly what her role would entail. She was in her 20s, confident and striking, with a keen sense of timing and a sharp understanding of the part she'd play in this charade. Within the hour, she'd arrived at the house, looking every bit the part in a simple but alluring black dress, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. "Thank you for coming, Emily," I said, gesturing toward the living room. "I'm sorry to pull you into all this, but I think it will be worth it." She gave a nod, her expression one of understanding. "I'm ready, Jason. I know exactly what to do." As we settled into place, I could hear the familiar sound of Rachel's car pulling up outside. My pulse quickened, though my resolve held steady. I could almost imagine her rehearsing her excuses in those final moments, polishing the lies she thought I'd buy. But this time, her lies would have no place to land. The front door opened, and Rachel stepped inside, her heels echoing on the hardwood floor. She called out, her tone somewhere between tentative and hopeful. "Jason, I'm home." "In here," I called back, keeping my voice casual. She appeared in the doorway, and the sight of me sitting beside Emily made her freeze. Her eyes widened, a flush rising to her cheeks as she took in the sight of this younger woman seated comfortably in our home, her hand resting on my arm, her gaze cool and unbothered. "Jason, what's going on here?" Her voice trembled, but she forced a brittle smile, attempting to feign innocence. "Who is this?" "Emily," I replied smoothly, gesturing to her as if introducing an old friend. "We were just getting comfortable. I hope you don't mind." Rachel's expression shifted, the shock and confusion replaced by a spark of fury. "Are you serious?" She glanced from Emily to me, her tone hardening. "You bring her here, into our home?" Emily raised an eyebrow, but stayed silent, perfectly in character. I turned to Rachel, meeting her eyes steadily. "I thought you'd understand. After all, you just had a work weekend with Nate, didn't you?" She took a step forward, her voice rising with incredulity. "Jason, that's not the same thing. Nate and I," she stopped herself, visibly floundering, the flush deepening. "It's not what you think. I told you, it was a professional trip. I was working." "Oh, were you?" I let a small, humorless smile tug at the corners of my mouth. "Is that why you were sharing hotel rooms and meeting up for private dinners?" "Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been working on something other than legal cases." She tried to keep her composure, her jaw clenched tight. "Jason, I told you you're misinterpreting things. Nate and I are just friends." "Friends," I repeated, the word ringing hollow. "Well, let's take a closer look at that friendship, shall we?" I pulled out the envelope I'd prepared, setting it on the table between us and motioning for her to open it. She hesitated, eyes darting to Emily, who watched her impassively. Rachel's hands shook as she flipped through the photos, each one more damning than the last. Her laughter with Nate, his hand on her back, their closeness at the restaurant. And finally, the image of them entering that suite in Austin. With each picture, her face drained of color. She swallowed hard, the facade cracking. "Jason, please. I can explain." "Explain?" I leaned back, folding my arms. "Go ahead, Rachel. I'd love to hear how you explain sneaking around behind my back, using our marriage as a cover for your own little escapades." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but I didn't flinch. Not this time. She took a deep breath, attempting to regain her composure. "Jason, I was confused. Nate, he understands things about me. I was vulnerable, and he made me feel understood." I scoffed, barely holding back my contempt. "Did he? Or did he feed you a nice story about his own marriage being in shambles so he could lure you in?" Her eyes widened, and I could see the realization dawning, the truth she hadn't wanted to see. "Yes, Rachel. That's right. I know all about his lies. You weren't special to him. Just another woman he could manipulate with his sob stories." Rachel's voice broke, her attempt at defiance crumbling. "Jason, I swear, I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was a mistake. A mistake." I repeated, the words cold and deliberate. "Mistakes don't happen over weekends, Rachel. They don't happen in secret hotels or whispered phone calls. This wasn't a mistake. This was a betrayal, and you chose it." She took a step forward, her voice desperate. "Jason, please. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work it out." "No, Rachel." My voice was final, and I could see the impact in her expression. "This is beyond repair. And to make things clear, I've already spoken to the lawyers. Our accounts have been divided, You'll get a fraction of what we had, and that's more than you deserve." Her face twisted with anger and panic as she realized the full extent of what I was saying. You're taking everything?" "No, I'm taking what's mine." I nodded toward the door, where Emily was already gathering her things, slipping out quietly without a word. "You'll be left with enough to start over, Rachel. But you'll be starting from scratch." She stared at me, horror flickering across her face as the reality set in. "Jason, please. I made a mistake, but it wasn't real with Nate. I thought I wanted something, but I didn't." "Enough," I interrupted, my voice hard as stone. "Whatever you thought you wanted, whatever you told yourself, none of it matters now. The trust we had, whatever love was left, it's gone, Rachel." She watched as I went to the door, gesturing for her to follow. "It's time for you to leave. I'll have my lawyer send over the paperwork by tomorrow. You'll have a choice. Accept what I've offered, or prepare for a public trial, where every sordid detail of your affair will be laid bare for everyone to see." She hesitated, her expression shifting to something almost pleading. "Jason, you're really ending this?" "Rachel," I said, my voice colder than I ever thought possible. "It was over the moment you chose him." The process moved forward swiftly, with Rachel's departure marking the beginning of a new, colder chapter. I wasted no time. My lawyers were already on retainer, and they pounced into action. I didn't cut corners. This divorce was a transaction, a cleanup operation. My only aim was precision and a clear end. Rachel's initial reaction was predictable. She fought back, stubbornly clinging to the idea that she deserved an equal share. But she had underestimated my resolve, the depths to which I'd go to ensure that she walked away with as little as possible. Our lawyers exchanged blows in legal filings, both sides preparing for what would have been a bruising public showdown. But when we presented the photos, the evidence, the trail of her deceit, it was clear Rachel's case had no legs to stand on. Her lawyer's confidence evaporated, replaced with reluctant compromises and the quiet acceptance that she would get only a fraction of what she expected. Meanwhile, I kept in touch with Allison. Oddly, she became something of an anchor, a steady presence as the storm played out. We never discussed our conversations too deeply. We were like comrades, silently united by the shared aftermath of betrayal. There was no hint of romantic interest, just a mutual understanding, each of us navigating our own wreckage. "I have to admit," she said one evening over coffee, "I didn't think Nate would go so far. Part of me still believed he'd come to his senses before everything fell apart." "They never do," I replied quietly. "They're willing to risk everything, but when it crumbles, it's too late for them to pick up the pieces." Allison nodded, her expression both sad and resolute. "I'm trying to let go, but it's not easy." "None of this is," I said, and we left it at that, both of us carrying our burdens, but strangely lighter for having shared them. I channeled the rest of my energy into work. With Rachel out of the picture, I found a renewed drive, pushing my projects forward with a focus I hadn't felt in years. My business expanded, and as the weeks went on, I began to fill my life with pursuits I'd neglected: travel, time with friends, even new hobbies that kept my mind active. Slowly, the house that had once felt empty became a place of quiet, a sanctuary rather than a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Rachel's downfall, however, was far less serene. Word of her affair with Nate had slipped through the cracks of her professional network. In a field where reputation was everything, whispers of her indiscretions echoed through her law firm. I didn't have to lift a finger. The truth seemed to spread on its own. Soon enough, Rachel found herself isolated, her professional relationships strained, and her once promising career tainted by the scandal. One evening, my lawyer called to inform me the judge had finalized the settlement. I retained nearly everything: the house, the assets, even most of the savings. Rachel, meanwhile, walked away with barely enough to cover the basics for a few months. The weight lifted off my shoulders as I realized it was finally over. Days slipped by in a quiet rhythm, and for the first time, I could look at my life without seeing the wreckage Rachel had left behind. I'd cut out every remnant of our marriage, and yet Rather than satisfaction, I felt only a strange emptiness where my anger had once been. Perhaps it was the cost of revenge, this hollowness and victory. Months later, as I was preparing for a business trip, an unexpected message appeared on my phone. It was from Rachel, just her name on the screen, stirring up memories I'd worked to bury. "Jason, I'd like to talk. Please. Just once." I stared at the message, considering every possible reason she could have to reach out. I didn't need to respond. There was no obligation left between us. And yet, part of me was curious. Perhaps she had something to say, some last word she'd left unsaid in the ruins of our marriage. I agreed to meet her, choosing a quiet cafe across town. I arrived early, sitting by the window as the sun dipped below the skyline. A few minutes later, she appeared, looking thinner, worn down by the months of fallout. Her gaze met mine, a glimmer of the old Rachel in her eyes, as she approached and sat down across from me. "Jason," she began softly, folding her hands on the table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "What did you need, Rachel?" She hesitated, the words caught somewhere between pride and regret. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." I waited, giving her the space to say whatever she'd come here for. "I never meant for it to end this way," she continued, her eyes fixed on the table. "I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I was hurt, lonely, but that doesn't excuse any of it. I understand that now." She looked up, her gaze filled with something resembling sincerity. "I lost everything, Jason, and it took that for me to see how badly I betrayed you." I studied her, feeling a strange sense of distance. There was a time when her words might have pierced me, stirred something deep within. But now, as I listened, I felt only a calm detachment, as though I were observing a stranger. She seemed to sense it too, her expression faltering. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that if I could go back, I would undo it all. You didn't deserve any of this." There was silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. At last, I nodded, acknowledging what she'd said. "I appreciate that, Rachel, but we can't go back. What's done is done." She swallowed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Do you think there's ever a chance for us to start over?" The question hung between us, fraught with unspoken history. I searched her face, and for a brief second, glimpsed the woman I'd once loved, the woman who had been my partner before everything unraveled. But that was a memory, a shadow, nothing more. "No, Rachel," I replied gently but firmly. "I've moved on. I think it's time you do the same." She blinked, absorbing the finality in my words, and nodded slowly. "I understand." We sat in silence for a moment longer, two people bound by a past, but no longer sharing a future. At last, she rose, offering a faint, bittersweet smile. "Goodbye, Jason. Goodbye, Rachel." I watched as she walked away, feeling only a deep, unshakable sense of closure. It was over. Whatever ties had bound us had dissolved, leaving me free of the weight I'd carried for so long.